For this interview, I feel a bit like a kid in a zoo. Since our very first ChemCon TV interviews back in 2014, we've already had 5 Korea-focused conversations. So you could say ChemCon has become a natural habitat for discussing K-REACH developments. And today we are in excellent company. 2 experts ready to guide us through this evolving regulatory ecosystem. Min-Jung Kim from Ramboll and Eunhee Tark from Chemtopia. Let's step into the habitat. We often hear about Korea's regulatory ecosystem. So, how do K-REACH, K-BPR, K-OSHA and the Chemicals Control Act interact in practice?
I would say that they're closely interconnected. For example, K-REACH is a regulation that basically, if you register the substance, the government would assess these substances, and then the government would have the hazard and risk assessment. And if they happen to find the chemicals to be hazardous, then all those hazardous chemicals will be then classified into hazardous substances under CCA. And that is how K-REACH complements K-CCA. And then those once classified hazardous substances will be then would have a little bit more stricter rules under K-OSHA. So that's how they are interconnected.
Okay, thank you. Eunhee, want to add something?
As Min-Jung already specified, I would say that K-REACH has like its regulation on the substance level, whereas like the K-OSHA and like K-BPR is like in the product level, and K-CCA is like just sums up everything and have it from substance level to product level to the facility level and to manage the chemical management and risks inside Korea. So yeah.
Okay. Hey, K-REACH continues to evolve. What are the most impactful changes since the last registration deadline in 2024?
I think one of the biggest thing is that it now has the upper limit of the tonnage band that they have already completed registration. So the company should actually start monitoring of their tonnage band. If the company is an overseas company, they have to have their importers listed in their dossier, which means they have to somewhat, I would say not somewhat, but very much manage their tonnage allocation to each importers and to make sure that their tonnage band is not exceeding the upper limit of their registration tonnage band.
We now see new species entering the ecosystem, like unconfirmed hazardous substances. What are those and how are companies dealing with stricter hazard classification expectations?
Hazard unconfirmed substances or unconfirmed hazard substances or hazard undetermined substances. There are many ways to call it, but I usually just call it hazard undetermined substances if you just translate it as it is. And hazard undetermined substances are new substances less than 1 ton if you locally manufacture or import it into Korea. So those are new substances, which are less than 1 ton without the toxicological data. So and naturally, the government basically sees those hazard undetermined substances as hazardous unless proven otherwise. And then if you notify it, when you notify a new substance, you just have to self-verify whether your new substance is as hazard undetermined substance or not. But before they said that it's not going to be mandatory to select your new substance as hazard undetermined substance, but then it turned out that you must check. You just need to check everything by yourself. So it's kind of like you have to go through a pre-DGA process, and the government gave you the list of 20-something websites where you have to look into every individual, and then you actually have to provide a proof and evidence that you have checked it, and only then, and after only your confirmation, you can determine whether your new substance is hazard undetermined substance or not.
Okay, thank you. You already mentioned tests, only for K-REACH registrations. MCEE, the Ministry of Climate, Energy and Environment, offers financial support for certain tests. What are the criteria to receive this financial support?
Companies located inside Korea who are small, medium-sized can apply for the subsidy program. For the test production subsidy program, usually it will be for, I know there is one program that is currently open. You have to apply for it and per substance, and you will have to be selected for each substance for which endpoint, but the current program is like up to like the below 10 tonnage band test points, like which is like acute oral or like physical chemical data. So you can apply for it, but you have to be small medium sized subsidy, small medium sized company inside Korea. So yeah.
And to clarify that, you say you have to be a small medium enterprise, but of course the tests are done for a CCO, the Korean groups that make it.
Yes.
So having one SME in that CCO is enough, or should they all be SMEs?
The applicant, has to be the small medium size, and before it used to be how you have to have like certain number of members in the CCO who like more than 2 or 3 members of SMEs in the CCO, but they are currently like changing like many different like criterias in the application, and so I think it really will vary per the timeline and the program.
And maybe MJ, you can answer that. If there is already a test under EU REACH, those tests can also be purchased and used. Will then these kind of tests be out of scope of the financial support, and is the negotiation the most important part, or is the financial support from the ministry basically competing with tests already on the market?
Basically, how I see this is in 2 different categories. So first of all, the government can provide consulting support program, but also the government can provide the data generation. So if you're talking about the data generation for such program, so lead registrant must be SME, but then they also apply for it, and you must be selected. And once your substance has been selected, and before your substance gets selected, the government actually does all the previous, all the pre-initial work to select the substance, right? That means that they do the DGA on their own, and if they see any substance that lacks the data, so from EU or from other global countries, then that's how they select the substances.
You talked about data. If we stay in the zoo theme, regulators have their favorite food. Which test data are they really hungry for after the 21 and 24 registrations?
I would say I think it's like even in Korea, I think it's very similar to EU REACH as well. The authorities definitely looking at like the reproductive toxicity for sure, endocrine disruptors and everything. But what I have recently figured is about the toxicity to marine life as well, especially like really recent cases that I've been facing, like several cases actually, are that they are actually improving the interpretation of the ready biodegradability. So the test, of course, there are like test reports of ready biodegradability, but how they interpret it has become like evolving, and that they are like requesting more data such as like inherently biodegradable or like pH hydrolysis and stuff. And of course that actually impacts the marine, like the toxicity, like the interpretation of like the classification for toxicity to marine life. Although we have like, they submit, like when we submit the dossier, we submit like the other toxicity data, but it impacts the classification definitely. So I think those 3 2 to 3 test points are definitely what they are looking into.
Okay, nice.
Yeah, for me, I like to add here, but for me, it's extended 1 generation. Yeah, because these days I've been facing a lot of government evaluation of the substances that were registered in 2024, and when the government completed a couple of risk assessment, and now like these days we're getting a lot of test order, or let's say order on submitting more data. For us, what hit us is that the government really followed up with the recent development of, for example, a substance that where ECHA informed them to submit the additional human health data, then Korean government also asked the same data, right? Yeah. So for us, it's extended 1 generation, which caused because of the Korean authority, the Korean companies submitted the second-gen toxicity data, but the Korean authorities saw the opportunity that ECHA has the extended one generation, so they're asking the same the data that was submitted to ECHA.
Okay, thank you. The recent reforms of the Chemicals Control Act introduced new hazard categories like acute, chronic, environmental. How does that impact industry, MJ?
Yeah, the companies definitely are having facing the burdens and challenges, but I think it was for the future purpose of having hopefully lifting the burden in the future. How if it was toxic substance as a whole, for example, if the classification was only for aquatic, but if they had to do compliances for acute hazard, it's going to be a much burden for them in future. So hopefully it will have much less burden for them in future.
Can I add one more? So the classification under CCA is also impacting them to have a different prevention program for the accident prevention substances, because that's what CCA is for. It's to prevent the accidents for the workers. Also, it has changed the facility standards for those upgraded, classified substances, and therefore it's changing their workplace ethics too. But it's also changing and impacting the other regulation like K-OSHA.
Okay, as already mentioned earlier in the interview, another change is the option to replace your only representative. Now, you're both consultants, so tell me, what makes a good OR and what mistakes should companies avoid, Annie?
A good OR, I think, should provide comprehensive consultation. So as we have already discussed, Korea is composed of different regulations, including K-REACH, K-OSHA, K-BPR, and K-CCA. And of course, the OR must be appointed separately per regulation. And one OR may not be able to provide all the consultation for throughout different regulations, but a good OR should actually provide at least a big picture of what they should, what a company should do throughout to actually handle the chemicals inside Korea. If, as I said, because OR may be different per regulation, it may be a little difficult, but at least the minimum that they should do is to provide a vague image of what the company should be looking for to stay compliant throughout different regulations in Korea.
I think the good OR should be able to put himself or herself in client's shoes, because I know that going through the complex Korean regulations, and you just have to comply with it, and as a client you are in constant risk, right? And so I think the good OR must be able to take some burden out of those legal responsibility, but you also have to be provide, it should be like what she said, you should be able to provide a big picture for the client, but you also have to be able to, let's say, weigh the, so take some of the weights out from the clients. And I think a good OR should be able to think, reflect, but strives for the client's responsibility. Yes, and try not to be so focused on the task-oriented, that you should be able to fully grasp the whole picture. That's what I think the good OR should be.
Okay. Industry is now preparing for the 2027 deadline. With a bit of a meerkat mindset, what should companies be watching closely?
For 2027 deadline, that is for the 10 to 100 tonnage bin. As we are going to the lower tiered tons registration, we, as it has been in EU as well, we are expecting much larger sets of substances to be registered, and maybe even more numbers of companies will require registration. Companies who are looking to register should actually, I would say, they should move fast, way in advance. Of course, there are substances where the higher tonnage bin must have completed registration for the lead registration, and that they can just go for the passive or late registration. But companies definitely should look out for the ones that do not have the lead registration or registration completed. because a lot of like Korean companies are composed of like small, medium-sized enterprises. A lot of companies in Korea are like hesitant to take the lead role in the first place. With that, also because like the finances and like the data and everything. So if a company is like an overseas company who have like registered the substance or have taken the lead role in EU, definitely they are more likely, it is very much likely that no one might not show up as a lead in Korea. So I would say looking out if and verifying whether there is the lead role like already taken or not, and prioritize which substances you will require registration. And if you have like a list of substances that you must register in Korea, and if there's no lead, that should be the first priority to move forward to, I would say. Yeah.
So I agree with her. Right now, currently, the authorities pretty busy because actually a lot of lead registrant had submitted their dossier already. So they're going through the evaluation at the moment. But I still see a lot of Korean consortiums, so we call that CCO. I see a lot of CCOs without lead, and no companies would like to step out to become the lead because first of all, it causes financial burden. You have to plan everything ahead, and then therefore there are companies, there are CCOs that are hesitant to even select or vote for the lead registrant, and I think the company should plan B, but they need to plan out plan B or plan C, D even, and I think they should engage in supply engagement. I think they should go for that. They should talk to their suppliers, and they should talk to their upstream user, and they need to really register. They need to create the better registration plan for 2027.
Okay, taking planning into account, looking further ahead towards the 2030 deadline, how should companies prioritize their registration roadmap now?
I would say the overall registration strategy would be quite similar to how to prepare for 2027, but for 2030 it will be like the end of the grace period for the all tonnage ban. So before it ends, I think it is really important to make sure that companies stay aligned with not only K-REACH but other regulations like K-OSHA, and also be prepared whether they have their information communicated to their downstream users, and that they can stay compliant for K-CCA as well. Of course, as mentioned before, tonnage ban and the important list if you're overseas manufacturers have to be maintained. And I would say for 2030, you would have to build up a system to actually make sure you can start off from after the 2030 grace period to actually align the entire chemical management system internally.
For me, I think companies should plan ahead because if you really think about the lower tonnage ban, that means you could have more than 10 or 20 substances, right? So you need to plan ahead. But also, I thought that was actually a difficult question to answer because business is like a living organism, and you can never have a constructive plan for 2030, especially the Koreans. The Korean companies are SMEs, so we don't really have promises for the future. And therefore, when you really, need to engage in supply chain communication with all your suppliers, but for substances where you think and you foresee that registration is required, then you really need to act toward that. Maybe they're starting registration in 2028, maybe trying to concrete the business that you have along. That's what I think they should do.
Okay. Unlike EU REACH, polymers are clearly part of K-REACH's natural habitat. Are there any lessons learned or pitfalls to share on polymer registrations?
Yes, polymer registration it can really be complicated. I've experienced several cases, but I think that the most important part of polymer registration is setting the substance identity profile. As it is a polymer, it can the identity or like the properties, characteristics can vary depending on the substance identity. So, and polymer registration, as it can be done jointly, it may be really difficult to set up the boundary range of the lead dossier. So I guess building the substance identity profile is definitely the key important thing. Checking whether this substance is categorized as polymer in Korea and whether it actually can apply for exemption or not is also the key point to check. And if the polymer requires registration, you will have to go through DGA and then identifying which endpoints can be submitted jointly and which one cannot be submitted jointly. It will also be the key point to figure. For certain polymers, let's say if the polymer is a UVCB polymer, physicochemical data may not be jointly submitted, while some other general polymers, physicochemical can be jointly submitted. So it's, I guess, like identifying in detail about the substance identity in the first place and what can be done jointly and not will be important. Okay,
and what are the exemption criteria for polymers?
So for polymer registration, I would say for us, I would say that having the better test strategy, so having the better data strategy is very important, because Korea is the only country that allow a polymer registration and we don't know when EU is going to happen.
We don't know either.
Yeah, but then if you really think about it, if you can reutilize the polymer data again once in Europe or somewhere in global, I don't know when, yeah, but then, so having the better test strategy, especially for polymers, is very important, I think. And for exemption criteria for polymers, I can tell you right away, but you have a certain molecular weight conditions. And you also have some of the, it's actually very complicated. You have to have a GPC data. So you need to have a molecular weight analysis data in order to confirm that your polymer can be exempted or not.
Okay, thank you. We discussed K-REACH, but we should not forget about K-BPR. What are the key challenges and opportunities in this space?
I focus mainly in K-REACH, but as I see my colleagues going through the challenges, I think overall it's the regulation that takes time. K-BPR has been implemented due to its need of it. So because of the historical accidents and everything, it has been implemented, but there is definitely a gap between the implemented regulation and the actual practice that can occur. So, and because it has been implemented due to its need of it, and due to the Korean culture, if there is a just-in-case situation, we would rather take the more conservative sides than be open to negotiate or anything. So because of the history as well, there is still the gap, and it's taking much more longer time to fill in the gap than, yeah. So I would say, I know in EU, the EU BPR is doing pretty good. And also one of the key difference in EU and Korea is that I think this applies for the REACH as well, but if in EU, if you submit the dossier, you can start handling the products right away, whereas in Korea, you have to get everything approved before you start handling the products or substances. So that also plays a big role in BPR as well, how in K-BPR, you have to have the products all approved before you can start using the products, whereas in EU, it's just, you can start handling this products as soon as you get the dossier submitted, and then you will have the assessment later. So I think that's one of the things that's making the K-BPR situation a little more difficult. But of course, we have rooms for improvement, just like any other regulations. And I guess we have to study more, learn more, research more, and then discuss, I guess, like more of like how to improve the situation.
One of the most challenges that I see in terms of K-BPR is that a lot now the remaining biocides, most of them are preservatives. But we don't really have any efficacy test guideline from the authority yet. And I do understand that with the government, there are a lot of ongoing projects within the government that try to develop our own guidance document, but also guidelines for efficacy testing. But again, the companies are facing the actual approval, basically the registration of biocides without actual guidelines, and we don't really know when it's going to happen. But also on top of that, we do have a very strict rule when it comes to labeling. So for companies, most companies in Korea, they are basically the biocide or the treated article producers, and a lot of so there are a lot of restraints when it comes to the commercial labeling as well. And I see that my clients often face a very difficult they put themselves in a very difficult situation because the difference, there's a discrepancy between the regulation and what the real life practice.
Let's take a look at K-OSHA. What lessons have we learned from the transition so far? And are companies perhaps underestimating the operational impact of workplace safety compliance in Korea?
Since after the transition and like all the companies have like started submitting MSCSs and like the CLPs, of course, we actually, I think what I can say is that there has definitely been an improvement of how to handle substances and how to be actually precautious of like the handling substances and all.
For K-OSHA, I would say that, we, for example, like companies, Korean companies would have about maybe the maximum of 3-4, so team consisted of a maximum of 3-4 people that take care of the K-OSHA obligation, right? And again, with the interconnected regulation, the EHS people that we know that they are only focusing on the hazardous substances that actually that are governed by K-OSHA. But not only that, they have to now look after the K-OSHA regulation, they also have to look into CCA, they also have to look into K-REACH. So there are a lot of work for them, and most of them really having difficulties even understanding the one clause of for example, SDS, right? They don't know, they don't even know how to classify their own products because they don't really have any information from their upstream user. A lot of information that are under the SDS were or just, it's basically a copycat of for example, EU SDS. But somehow they have to manage not only the substances that they control in Korea, but now they also have to look into the other regulations, and it's been a very, very big problem for them. And again, I hope that in the future that maybe the 3 regulations would be more closely connected.
Okay. Final question. What is the biggest compliance risk or challenge in Korea today?
As long as I know, I think in December 2025, the Korea government has published of the 3rd basic plan of the chemical substance management and the chemical risk, chemical accident responses for 2026 and 2030. And again, the K-REACH grace period is coming to an end in 2027 and 2030. So I think the whole timeline is going towards 2030. And companies actually should, as we've been repeatedly saying, there are different regulations in Korea, and it is important to not consider 2030 to be the end of the regulation, but rather it's the new start point. Companies should have everything aligned before that, and checking the system, building the internal system of making sure that they are they are staying compliant to like different regulations, I think is very important.
For me, when the authority, before they announce the amendment of regulation, they they always give the public consultation period to companies, but then the public consultation period is very, very short. It's less than a month. Usually it's like less than 30 days, and sometimes if more, it could be a month, right? And within a month, companies that are impacted by the amendment, they have to gather all their opinions, and there are certain ways where you have to submit your opinions to the authority, and emails is not accepted, so and you need to have the list of all the signatures of companies, and therefore it's a very close window for companies to actually start the discussion with the authority. So I would say that short public consultation period is a one thing. And another challenge that I see is often the Korean authority, when they announce something, they have their own, let's say, Korean word format. So it's almost impossible for other foreigners to check that, and which also connects that we don't really have an English translation.
MJ and Eunhee, thank you both for guiding us through this fascinating ecosystem. And as our cartoon reminds us nicely, another milestone is already on the horizon, 2030. So the habitat keeps evolving and staying alert remains key.